said the prenup was just to protect his business, that it was standard, that it didn't change anything between us. And I believed him, because the way he explained it made sense. It wasn't emotional, it wasn't forced, just practical. So, I signed it, without thinking too much about the details, because I trusted him. But a few weeks later, I noticed something small. A clause I didn't fully understand the first time. The way it was written, what it actually covered. And the more I read it, the less it sounded like protection. And the more it sounded like preparation. That's when I realized this wasn't written for something that might happen. It was written for something he already expected. My name is Hannah. I'm 31 now, and at the time this happened, I was engaged and about 4 months away from getting married. Everything about my life felt settled. Not perfect, just clear in a way that made the future feel easy to step into. My fiancé, Daniel, was someone people described as driven, focused, structured. He had built his own business over a few years, and it had grown into something stable, not unpredictable, not risky, just established. That's how he approached everything. Carefully, logically. He didn't rush decisions, didn't act impulsively, and at the time I saw that as a good thing, because it made everything feel secure. Our relationship reflected that. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't intense. Just consistent. We didn't have constant emotional conversations. We didn't need to. Everything felt understood without needing to be explained. We had routines, ways of doing things, a structure that didn't change much. And that consistency made it easy to trust. We had been together for almost 3 years, and nothing about that time made me question anything. There were no major conflicts, no moments that felt unstable. Everything moved forward in a way that made sense, naturally. When he proposed, it didn't feel sudden. It felt expected, like the next step in something that was already working. And I said yes, without hesitation, because there wasn't a reason not to. The wedding planning started shortly after, and just like everything else with him, it was organized, clear, structured. We agreed on most things easily. There was no conflict over details, no tension around decisions. Everything aligned. At least, that's how it looked. There were small moments, though, things that didn't stand out at the time, but stayed in the background, like how he preferred to handle anything financial himself, not in a controlling way, just in a way that felt precise. He liked knowing exactly what was happening, what was being spent, what was being planned, and again that made sense, because of his business, because of how he operated. So, I didn't question it. I let him lead in those areas, because it felt like the practical choice. There were also moments where he would explain things in a very specific way, not over-explaining, just directing the conversation toward a conclusion, a clear outcome, and I followed that, because it sounded reasonable, because it always ended in something that made sense. That was the dynamic. He structured things. I trusted them. And that worked, because nothing in that structure felt wrong. Everything felt stable, predictable, safe. That's the word I would have used. Safe. Looking back, that was probably the first thing I didn't question enough. Not because it was wrong, but because I never tested it. I never looked at what was underneath it, because I didn't feel like I needed to. That's what trust does. It removes the need to look deeper. And I was fully in that place. The one where everything made sense. The one where nothing needed to be examined too closely. That's where I stayed. Even when he brought up the prenup. Because when he explained it, it sounded exactly like everything else he had ever explained. Structured. Logical. Necessary. He didn't present it emotionally. He didn't make it a big conversation. Just something practical. Something responsible. And the way he said it made it feel like it wasn't even a decision. Just part of the process. Something that needed to be done. Because of his business. Because of what he had built. And I accepted that. without hesitation, because at that point, there was no reason for me to question anything. Everything still fit into the same version of reality, the one where everything made sense, the one where everything was exactly what it looked like, until I actually read it properly and realized there were parts of it that didn't fit into that version at all. The first time I read it, I didn't really read it, not the way you're supposed to. I skimmed it, looked at the main sections, the parts that were explained to me: business protection, assets, liability, all the things he had already mentioned. And because it matched what he said, I didn't go deeper. I signed it without hesitation, because nothing in that moment felt complicated. It felt like something people in our position just did. That was it. It stayed like that for a while. The document existed, but it wasn't something I thought about again. It didn't feel relevant to anything happening in real time. It was just there. Then a few weeks later, I was going through some paperwork, not looking for anything specific, just organizing things. And I came across it again. The prenup. And this time I didn't rush through it. I had time. No pressure. No conversation guiding how I should understand it. So I read it differently. Slower. More carefully. Not just the sections he had explained. Everything. Line by line. And, at first, it still looked the same. Structured. Clear. Legal language. Nothing that stood out immediately. But then I reached a section I didn't remember clearly. Something that hadn't been part of his explanation. Not directly. It was written in a way that didn't feel important at first. Just another clause. Another condition. But the more I read it, the more I realized I didn't fully understand it. Not because it was complicated, but because it was specific, in a way that didn't match the rest of the document. So I read it again, slower this time, and I noticed something. It wasn't just about assets. It wasn't just about business protection. It mentioned behavior, conditions, situations that went beyond finances. That was the first shift, because up until that point, everything had been framed as practical. But this didn't feel practical. It felt intentional. I didn't jump to conclusions. I didn't react emotionally. I just kept reading, trying to understand what it actually meant. And the more I did, the more it stood out. Because it wasn't neutral. It was directional. It outlined specific scenarios. Situations where certain actions wouldn't affect anything legally, wouldn't change financial outcomes, wouldn't alter the agreement, even if those situations would normally matter. That's when it stopped feeling like standard protection and started feeling like something else, because it wasn't just protecting what he had built. It was protecting him from consequences. That was the part that stayed with me. Not loudly, just clearly. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Because I wanted to understand it fully first. Not react to something I only partially understood. So I kept reading. The wording, the structure, the way everything was connected. And it all pointed in the same direction. This wasn't just about separating assets. It was about controlling outcomes. No matter what happened. That was the realization. Small at first, then clearer the more I looked at it. I went back to the beginning. Read the whole document again. Not for information, but for context. To see how everything connected. And once I did, that clause didn't feel isolated anymore. It felt placed, deliberately, within the structure, like it had always been part of the intention. That's when something shifted completely. Because now I wasn't just reading a document. I was seeing what it was designed to do. And it didn't match what I had been told. At all. I still didn't react. I didn't bring it up. Because I needed one thing. Clarity. Not from the document. From him. Because if what I was understanding was correct, then this wasn't just about protection. It was about expectation. And that's what I needed to confirm. Before I said anything. Before I changed anything. I needed to know if this was something he had prepared for, or something he was planning to use. After that, I stopped looking at the prenup as just a document, because it wasn't anymore. Not in the way I had understood it before. Now it felt like something that needed context. Something that only made sense if I looked at everything around it. Not just the words, but him, his behavior, the way he handled things. And once I shifted into that, I started noticing things I hadn't before. Not new things, just things I had never questioned. The way he approached conversations, especially anything that involved accountability. He didn't avoid them, but he redirected them, calmly, in a way that made it hard to stay focused on the original point. At the time, I saw that as control, in a positive way. Now it felt different, more deliberate. I thought about past disagreements. Not many, but enough. And I realized something. They always ended the same way, resolved, but not necessarily explored. We didn't stay in conflict. We moved past it quickly. And at the time, that felt healthy. Now, it felt managed. Like certain things were never meant to be examined too closely. That was the first layer. Then I thought about how he handled boundaries. Not mine. Situations in general. Work. People. Commitments. He was very clear about what affected him. What didn't. What mattered. What didn't. And that clarity had always seemed like confidence. Now, it felt structured. Like he had already decided where consequences applied. And where they didn't. That connected directly to what I had read. Because that clause wasn't random. It reflected a mindset. Not just a legal precaution. A way of thinking. Where certain actions wouldn't change outcomes. That was the shift. Because now I wasn't looking at a document anymore. I was looking at a pattern. I also started thinking about timing. When he brought up the prenup, how he explained it, and how quickly everything moved after that. There was no space to question it deeply. No time where it sat unanswered. It was introduced, explained, signed, all within a structure that felt efficient. And that mattered. Because when something is given to you that quickly, you don't analyze it the same way. You trust the explanation. That's what I had done. And now I could see that clearly. I also noticed something else. The way he talked about trust. It came up occasionally. Not directly. Just in small comments. About how trust meant not overcomplicating things. Not questioning things unnecessarily. At the time, that sounded reasonable. Now it felt guided. Like it set the expectation for how I should respond. Not just to him, but to anything involving him. That was the second layer. Then I looked at the clause again. More carefully. Not just what it said, but what it allowed. Because that's where the meaning was. Not in what it restricted, but in what it didn't. And what it didn't restrict was behavior that would normally have consequences. That was the part that stayed with me. Because documents like that don't exist without intention. They're written for a reason. And reasons don't appear randomly. They're based on something. Possibility, expectation, or preparation. And once that thought settled in, everything connected. His control, his structure, his timing, the way he handled conversations, the way he framed trust. All of it aligned with one thing. Predictability. Not emotional unpredictability. Outcome predictability. Making sure that no matter what happened, the results stayed the same. And that's exactly what that clause did. It removed variables. It removed consequences. It kept everything fixed. No matter the situation. That's when it became clear. This wasn't just something he signed. This was something he understood completely. Something he expected to matter. I didn't confront him yet. Because I didn't need to. Not immediately. I already understood what I was looking at. I just needed one thing. Confirmation. Not from the document. From him. Because if this was intentional, then it would show up somewhere else. Not just on paper, but in how he responded when it was brought into the open. And that's when the question changed. Not what does this mean, but why would someone need this? Unless they already expected to use it. Once I understood that, I stopped looking at the prenup as something separate from him. Because it wasn't. It reflected how he thought. So I shifted how I paid attention. Not to what he said, but to how he handled situations that involved accountability. I didn't confront him. I didn't bring up the document. Because I needed to see how he operated without knowing I was looking. That's when patterns stay natural. I started noticing small things first. Conversations that would normally stay simple, but had the potential to go deeper. And every time they reached that point, he adjusted them. Not obviously, just slightly. He would reframe what was being discussed. Simplify it. Move it towards something that didn't require examination. And at the time, that kind of control feels like maturity. But now it felt intentional. Because it was consistent. Not once. Every time. I let those moments happen. Without interrupting them. Because I needed to see how often it happened. And it didn't take long. It was always the same structure. Nothing escalated. Nothing stayed open. Everything closed quickly. That matched what I had read. Because that clause did the same thing. It didn't prevent anything. It just removed the effect of it. That was the first connection. Then I paid attention to something else. His timing. Not in a suspicious way. Just with awareness. The way he described where he was. The way he explained his day. And I noticed something. There were no gaps. Not real ones. Everything was accounted for before I even thought to ask. Which sounds reassuring. Until you realize. Real life doesn't move that cleanly. There are always small inconsistencies. Small delays. Small things that don't fully line up. But with him, everything always did. That was the second connection. Not inconsistency. Overconsistency. I also started asking small, unexpected questions. Not about anything serious. Just things that weren't part of the usual flow. And every time I did, there was a pause. Not long. Just enough. Like he was choosing the version that fit best. Then he would answer. Come. Complete. And the conversation would move on. That pause stayed with me. Because it didn't belong in something natural. It belonged in something managed. I didn't react to it. I just noted it. Then I went back to the document again. Not to reread it entirely. Just that clause. The one that had shifted everything. And this time, I focused on what it allowed. Not what it said, but what it made possible. Because that's where the meaning was. And what it made possible was behavior without consequence. That was the core of it. And once I understood that clearly, I started looking for that same idea. In how he spoke. In how he responded. In how he handled things. And it was there. Not directly. Just consistently. Then I did something more intentional. One evening, we were having a normal conversation. Nothing serious. Just the kind that fills time. And I shifted it slightly. Not obviously. Just enough. I asked about relationships in general. Not ours. Just in theory. What do you think actually matters most when trust is broken? Simple question. Neutral. Something anyone could answer. He didn't hesitate. He answered calmly. Said that situations are rarely as clear as people think. That context matters more than actions. That people make mistakes that don't always define the relationship. And that consequences shouldn't always be immediate or absolute. The way he said it wasn't defensive. It was structured. Like something he had already thought through. Like something he had already decided. That was the third connection. Because that answer matched the clause. Exactly. Different words. Same meaning. I didn't challenge it. I didn't question it further. I just let the conversation move on. Because I didn't need more. But I still waited. A few more days. Just to see if anything else stood out. And it did. Small moments. The way he handled minor disagreements. The way he redirected anything that could lead to deeper discussion. The way everything stayed controlled, consistent, unchanged, no matter the situation. That's when it became complete. Not a suspicion, not a pattern I was still building, just something fully understood. The document, his behavior, his responses, all of it pointed to the same thing. This wasn't precaution. It was preparation. That was the shift. Because now the question wasn't what the prenup said. I already knew that. The question was why it needed to say it. And there was only one way to answer that. To ask him directly. And see if he responded. Like someone explaining something. Or someone who had already prepared for it. Because if this was intentional, then he wouldn't be surprised by the question. He would be ready. And that's what I needed to see. Not the answer itself, but how easily he gave it. By the time I brought it up, I wasn't confused anymore. There was nothing left to interpret. No uncertainty, just clarity. And that made the conversation simple. Not easy, just direct. I didn't wait for a perfect moment. I didn't build up to it, because I didn't need to. We were sitting together one evening. Nothing unusual. Normal conversation. The same way it always started. And I let it stay that way for a few minutes, because I wanted to see how he moved through it, without knowing what was coming. He talked about work, about things he was handling, the same structured tone, the same control. And then there was a pause, the kind that usually leads into something else. And that's when I spoke. I read the prenup again. Simple, neutral, no emotion in it. He looked at me, not surprised, just attentive. Okay, calm, like it wasn't a problem, like it didn't change anything. That was the first thing I noticed. No hesitation, no concern, just readiness. I nodded slightly. Then I said, "There's a clause you didn't explain." That was the shift. Small, but enough. He didn't interrupt, didn't ask which one. He just waited, and that told me something. Because most people would ask, they would clarify. He didn't. He already knew. I continued. The one about behavior not affecting anything legally. I kept it simple, didn't use legal terms, just meaning. And for a second, there was silence. Not confusion, not surprise, just stillness. And that stillness mattered, because it wasn't new to him. It was something he had already thought about. I asked the question directly. Why is that there? No emotion, no accusation, just clarity. He didn't answer immediately. There was a pause. Not long, but longer than anything before. And then he spoke. Calm, measured, the same way he always did. It's just protection. That was his answer. Simple, controlled, the same structure he had used from the beginning. But it didn't hold, because now I understood what it meant. I didn't argue. I didn't react. I just asked again. Protection from what? That was the moment everything shifted, because now the question couldn't be redirected. It couldn't be simplified. It required something specific, and he knew that. I could see it, not in what he said, but in how he paused again, slightly longer this time. Then he answered, more carefully. Situations can get complicated. That was his explanation. Not direct, not clear, just broad. And that told me everything, because he wasn't denying it. He was avoiding defining it. I looked at him and said, "You mean cheating, not as a guess, just stating what was already clear." And that was it. That was the moment everything stopped, because there was no version of that question that could be redirected. He didn't react immediately, and that silence confirmed everything, because up until that point, he always had something ready, but not this time, not in the same way. After a few seconds, he spoke, quietly, still controlled, saying that things aren't always that simple, that people make mistakes, that situations can happen, that don't need to define everything. The same structure, the same logic, the same way of removing consequence, but argue. I didn't raise my voice because I wasn't trying to change his perspective. I was seeing it clearly. For the first time, I said one thing: that's not protection. And then, it's permission. That was the shift. Final, clear, and I saw it land. Not emotionally, just completely. Because there was no way to adjust that. No way to explain around it. It was already defined. He didn't deny it, not directly. He just didn't respond. And that was enough. Because silence in that moment is confirmation. I didn't ask anything else. I didn't need to. The conversation had already reached its end. Not because everything was said, but because everything was understood. I stood up, calm, unhurried, and he didn't stop me. Not really. He said something about talking it through, about not making assumptions, but it didn't matter, because I wasn't assuming anything anymore. I was seeing it exactly as it was, and that was enough. I walked away from that conversation, not emotional, not overwhelmed, just clear, because once you understand something like that, there's nothing left to figure out. The structure explains itself, and from that point on, there was no version of this where I didn't know, and once that happens, there's only one thing left: what you choose to do next. After that conversation, everything felt settled, not in a good way, not in a bad way, just clear in a way that didn't leave room for anything else. I didn't go back to him, not to talk, not to explain, because there was nothing left to clarify. The moment had already answered everything, completely. He reached out later, a message that same night, then another the next day, calm, measured, trying to bring the conversation back into something manageable, saying things had been misunderstood, that I was taking it too far, that it was just legal protection, the same structure, the same control, but now I could see it for what it was, not explanation, just adjustment, and I didn't respond, not out of anger, just because there was nothing left to engage with, because once you understand something clearly, you don't need to go back into it, you step out of it. That's what I did. The next few days were quiet, not heavy, just consistent. For the first time in a while, everything matched. What I saw, what I understood, what I felt, there was no gap between them. And that made everything easier. Not emotionally, just practically. I started canceling things, not dramatically, just one step at a time. The venue, the vendors, the plans that had been built around something that no longer existed. And each step felt the same. Not difficult, just necessary. Because once the foundation changes, everything built on top of it has to follow. I didn't rush it. I didn't try to fix anything. I just moved forward, in a straight line, without looking back. People asked questions. Of course they did. Why things were changing. Why the wedding wasn't happening. And I kept my answers simple. Things didn't align. That was enough. Because the details didn't matter to anyone else. They only mattered to me. And I already understood them. Completely. My family noticed the shift. Not just in what was happening, but in how I was handling it. Calm, direct, no hesitation. And they didn't push, because there was nothing to push against. Everything was already decided. Daniel stopped reaching out after a while. Not suddenly, just gradually. Like he understood there wasn't anything left to continue. And that made sense, because there wasn't. Whatever version of the relationship existed before ended the moment I saw what that document actually meant. Everything after that was just time catching up to it. I thought about it a few times, not emotionally, just in a way that helped me understand it better. Because situations like that don't happen randomly. They're built, step by step, through choices, through patterns, through the way someone thinks. And that was the part that stayed with me. Not the document itself, but what it represented. Because it showed me something clearly, that you don't prepare for something like that. already believe it's going to matter. And once I understood that, everything else made sense. I didn't need closure from it. I didn't need an explanation that would make it easier. I already had something more stable than that. Clarity. And clarity doesn't need to be confirmed by someone else. It comes from what you already see. Now, when I think about it, it doesn't feel heavy. It feels precise, like something that revealed itself exactly when it needed to, because it showed me something I wouldn't have seen otherwise, that not everything presented as protection is actually meant to protect you. Sometimes it's meant to protect someone else from you seeing the truth. That was the part that mattered. And once I saw it, there was no version of things where I could ignore it. So I didn't. I chose something that already made sense, instead of trying to stay in something that didn't. And that was enough, because in the end, it wasn't about the prenup, it was about what it revealed. And once something reveals itself that clearly, you don't question it. You move on from it, quietly, completely, without needing anything else from it. That was the shift. And once it happened, everything stayed where it was supposed to be, with me. If you've ever trusted something because it sounded logical and only later realized what it actually meant, you probably understand the story. Sometimes the truth isn't hidden in big moments. It's in small details we don't question the first time. If this story made you think about something in your own life, let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, there are more waiting for you right here.